Hi there. My name is Holly Randall Moon. I'm a non-Indigenous lecturer in the School of Indigenous Australian Studies located at the Dubbo campus of Charles Sturt University. And what I'm going to do in this mini lecture is describe research methodologies appropriate to Indigenous Australian peoples and their communities and give you some historical context for why these methodologies have come about and why they are important. Before I get started, though, I would like to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Wiradjuri peoples on whose land I'm filming this video, and I pay respect to elders past, present, always. And I would like to extend that respect to any Indigenous peoples from other nations who are listening and watching this recording. What you can see here on the slide is two resources which are an excellent start to understanding qualitative and quantitative research methodologies devised by Indigenous researchers for Indigenous research. Firstly, though, I want to distinguish between Indigenous and Indigenous research methodologies. An Indigenous approach is an approach that can be undertaken by non-Indigenous researchers, so for people like myself, and an Indigenous approach involves centering Indigenous perspectives, methodologies, and sovereignty to research. An Indigenous approach is one undertaken by an Indigenous person. So for Indigenous students in the subjects, you will take up an Indigenous methodology. You may use an Indigenous approach to centering the perspectives of Indigenous peoples into non-Indigenous research methodologies, and for non-Indigenous students, you will be adopting an Indigenous approach. Why are Indigenous and Indigenous methodologies important? So there are two reasons for this. First, research on Indigenous peoples has continued to cause harm. An example is the role of racial science. Racial science is a quantitative methodological approach that categorized Indigenous peoples' identities according to developmental ideas about culture and civilization. And these ideas directly informed colonial and government policy in terms of the denial of Indigenous control over their own lives. Another example is the use of racial science in the early protection acts at the beginning of the 20th century. And these acts justify the removal of Indigenous children based on how Indigenous they were, according to racial classifications. The second reason is that because of these kinds of research practices, which operated well into the middle of the 20th century, Indigenous peoples in Australia are one of the most researched populations on the planet. But the vast majority of this research has been undertaken by non-Indigenous peoples. For this reason, a reflexive approach to research is a core component of Indigenous and Indigenous research methodologies. A reflexive approach involves being reflective about who you are and what your relationship to the research is. This differs from more traditional quant and qual approaches, which stress objectivity and distance from research. Within Indigenous knowledge systems, who you are, what your relationship to knowledge is, where you are from, who you know, this is the starting point for research. So let's have a look at the first resource here, which is by a Wiradjuri woman, Jess Ross Smith, which is a qualitative approach to Indigenous and Indigenous research methodologies. You might have heard of the term decolonisation before. Decolonisation is a walking backwards from colonisation. It means that you're turning your back on colonisation and you're walking away from it. It involves a critical gaze on colonial norms in structures, practices, and processes of delivery in health and well-being. It asks researchers to think about how colonial knowledges have informed contemporary institutions and knowledge practices. And as I just mentioned, asking these questions and doing these kinds of qualitative research investigations involves being reflexive about your own identity and position in relation to research. And a way of doing this kind of reflexive work is called standpoint theory or standpoint methodologies. So Russ Smith says that for First Nations decolonisation, it's, quote, a process that aims to rebuild sovereign nations through the restoration of Indigenous ontologies and ecologies. Ontologies means they're a way of being, and ecologies means a way of understanding the natural world. For non-Indigenous peoples, decolonisation involves reflection of their colonially conditioned understanding of Indigenous peoples and a responsibility to know and respect Aboriginal ways of being. So you can see there whether you're an Indigenous student in the subject or a non-Indigenous student, or you may have a more complex position. Russ Smith gives different pathways depending on your standpoint or your positioning and identity. Decolonisation in a research sense means self-determination over what research is conducted, how it benefits Indigenous communities. This includes sovereignty over language and identity. And I'd encourage you to check out Nathan Sentence's Indigenous referencing system, where the First Nations identity of a researcher or a research source is identified so readers can see which nation and which country the knowledge comes from when you look at the reference list at the end of the research article. And there has been some research that's been authored by country. So for instance, if you look up a first author Bawaka country, that is listed as the first, that country is listed as the first author of research. What this means is that within Indigenous knowledge systems, non-human actors are involved in generating research and knowledge. So knowledge systems for Indigenous peoples are not anthropocentric. Anthropocentric means human-centered and treating humans as the only important or superior knowledge holders. Taking an Indigenous approach to research also involves recognising the input of non-humans on the generation of research and data. Okay, so I'll go through the second resource I showed you, which is a quantitative approach to Indigenous and Indigenous research methodologies. And this is from an Indigenous woman, Maggie Walter from Tasmania. And she talks about the problems with non-Indigenous quantitative research is that it uses what she calls the 5 Ds of data. It focuses on a deficit approach: disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. Issues regarding data collection or the interpretation of data, so through statistics, for instance, are important to consider in your research practice. So some questions to think about here are, is there input from Indigenous Australians into the data collection? Walter talks about the absence of Indigenous peoples from quantitative research approaches as terra nullius research. People get turned into data and then disappear from the research landscape. Terra nullius is a Latin phrase which means land belonging to no one. And this was one of the bases on which settler invasion happened in Australia. The Australian landscape was represented as terra nullius. There's no one here. It was empty, so it's ready for filling with settlers. So she's using that to talk about quantitative research where Indigenous peoples as researchers are disappeared from the way data is collected. So they're disappeared from the research landscape, but it's a terra nullius kind of research. It's also important to emphasize, as I mentioned before, the quantitative impact of racial science. Race was invented to describe pathology, to describe dysfunction and justify white superiority. And so although racial science, thankfully no longer informs contemporary quantitative data collections or research on populations, Maggie Walter says that there's still a deficit approach to Indigenous populations. We've shifted from looking at Indigenous populations through the quantitative lens of racial unfitness to deficit people. So there's a quote here where she says, current Australian practices in regard to the collection of data on Indigenous peoples are the descendants of the data needs that emerged from colonisation. So we need to be thinking about quantitative approaches to data collection and what that collection is, what are the broader logics and knowledge systems that data is connected to. Another big issue in the way that data is collected about Indigenous populations is the lack of intersectionality, a lack of consideration of the diversity of Indigenous people. So intersectionality means that your identity is not just one thing, your identity intersects with a whole range of other identities. So for instance, my identity as a woman also intersects with my background is coming from a rural background, coming from a first in the family, my age. So your identity doesn't just encompass one thing. Your identity is intersecting with a whole range of other identities. And remember, for First Nations, it is the country that determines the importance and relevance of research data. So if you're working on Wiradjuri country, which is where I'm recording this video, for Wiradjuri people, they're not necessarily interested in data differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples as a whole across the nation or across the state. It's the country that determines, and the First Nation that determines the relevance and the importance of data. An example of what can happen with the lack of intersectionality is this example. So although this example it's almost 10 years old, until recently, we didn't have a lot of data on Indigenous LGBTQ population, because when health data was collected, through intake forms, people didn't think to also add another box which says, are you LGBT? Are you trans? So obviously, when we're thinking about health and probably housing and employment as well, the needs of trans Indigenous peoples are quite different to the needs of heterosexual or straight Indigenous Australians. So you can see how the way that data is and the quantitative approaches to data collection can work to have some real limitations if there's not an understanding of the diversity of Indigenous populations. So I'll just finish up by saying that what I've done is given you a very brief overview of what Indigenous approaches mean, what Indigenous approaches mean. I've given you a very brief overview of qualitative approaches using the Russ Smith reading and quantitative approaches using the Walter reading. And I've also given you a very brief historical context as to why it's important to centre the research perspectives of Indigenous researchers and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. I've also just popped my email on the slide there, so do feel free to email me if you've got any questions about any of the things that I've discussed. So I do hope that was helpful for you, and good luck with your assessments and with the subject. See you later.